Welcome everyone. We have a few housekeeping announcements to get us started. This webinar is being recorded and all participants are muted. The session recording and presentation will be sent out to participants within the next few days. Participants may submit questions through the Q&A box at any point during the session, and panelists will answer if they are able to. At the end of the presentation, we will have a live Q&A session. During the Q&A, please use the raise your hand function to ask your question. If you are on your computer, you should see a button by your name. Please make sure you are unmuted by checking the microphone button on the lower left of your screen. If you are calling in, you may press *9 to raise your hand and then *6 to unmute your phone, or simply use your phone's own mute-unmute function. Once the moderator calls on you, your line will be open and you can ask your question. I will now turn it over to NAFOA's Executive Director, Rico Frias, for introductions.
Good afternoon and thank you for joining us today. My name is Rico Frias and I am the Executive Director of NAFOA. I want to thank EDA in joining with us and putting this webinar together regarding the Indigenous Communities Program. This is our third webinar in partnership with EDA, and I want to also commend the Department of Commerce for its outreach into Indian country. There is an unprecedented amount of money targeted to Indian country right now, and as we work together to rebuild tribal economies after the pandemic, we at NAFOA want to ensure that tribes are aware of all the different allocations that are out there. It would be a shame for these funds to sit unspent. So as part of the American Rescue Plan, EDA is allocating $100 million for Indigenous communities. And so it's, I think, an exciting opportunity, and we hope we'll get as many applicants as we did for the NTIA's program for broadband. At this point, it is my pleasure to introduce Assistant Secretary Alejandra Castillo. Alejandra Castillo serves as the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development and the Administrator of the Economic Development Administration. Alejandra is a committed public servant with expertise in the fields of public policy, legislation, and federal programs. She's an accomplished leader who has served with distinction in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, where she advocated for economic development and job creation. In 2014, Castillo was appointed by President Obama to serve as the National Director of the Commerce Department's Minority Business Development Agency, MBDA, becoming the first Hispanic woman to lead the agency. Thank you, Assistant Secretary Castillo. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Rico, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the partnership. Truly, truly appreciate it. I very much appreciate NAFOA's mission of supporting the advancement of independent and culturally vibrant American Indian and Alaskan Native communities. Thank you for hosting this important information session. And Rico, just what you said goes to the heart of the matter. This is an unprecedented moment in time, one in which we to not only further our partnership and our relationship, but one where we want to make sure that we're leveraging the resources that have been designated. So to all the tribal leaders online with us today, thank you for your participation. It's truly an honor to be working with you. Under President Biden's leadership, the federal government is coordinated to ensure that our tribal nations and Indigenous communities have the resources they need to thrive today and build the resilient economies of the future. At the Economic Development Administration, also known by our acronym EDA, we are committed to strengthening tribal sovereignty and self-governance, and the goal of the fulfillment of federal trust, responsibilities, and treaty obligations to tribal nations. We are excited to be with you today to share how EDA can support your economic development efforts. First, EDA has been allocated $3 billion under President Biden's American Rescue Plan to assist communities nationwide in efforts to build back better. We will do this by supporting your locally driven strategies designed to accelerate the economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic and building strong local economies. Known collectively as Investing in America's Community, this EDA investment is the largest economic development initiative from the Department of Commerce in decades. Let me say that again, it's the largest investment in economic development in decades. With an emphasis on equity, EDA's investments made under the American Rescue Plan will directly benefit previously underserved communities impacted by COVID-19. As you may know, on July 22nd, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo announced the 6 programs that EDA is now executing to equitably invest this vital funding. Through our Indigenous Communities Program, EDA is allocating $100 million in American Rescue Plan funding specifically for Indigenous communities, which, as you know, were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. This is a historic investment, as I said before, and it is the first time that EDA has designated a unique funding stream for tribes. Now, let me just be clear. It doesn't mean that other funding are not available. I'm just trying to draw your attention to this very specifically designated pool of dollars. Nonetheless, there are other pools of dollars and funding opportunities available through EDA. So I just want to make sure that I clarify that. We are excited to support you and your work to develop and execute economic development projects that will help your recovery from the pandemic and build economies for the future. Our Deputy Assistant Secretary and Chief Operating Officer, Dennis Alford, will be providing an in-depth overview of our Indigenous communities funding opportunity later in the program. But I also want to note, however, that tribal organizations and Indigenous communities are also eligible, as I mentioned before. So I want to encourage you tremendously to consider the other 5 American Rescue Plan programs. And let me tell you what they are. There's the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, which will invest $1 billion in up to 30 regions to capitalize on American ingenuity and American by providing a transformational investment to regions across the country. We will leave the definition of regions to you, but it is an opportunity to really think at a macro level and at a regional level what economic development means to you, as well as how it can impact your respective communities. In addition, we have the Good Jobs Challenge, which allocates $500 million towards industry-led workforce training programs to help get Americans, particularly women, people of color, and those in underserved communities back to work in good paying jobs. The third is an injection of $500 million in economic adjustment assistance into our communities. These grants will help hundreds of communities across the nation plan, build, innovate, and put people to work through projects tailored to meet local needs. And then 4th is the Travel, Tourism, and Outdoors Recreation Program. This is $700 million of EDA American Rescue Plan funds, which are allocated to support the sector of travel, tourism, and outdoors recreation. I'm just going to make a pause here because $100 million or so was provided to the states, but there's a remaining $250 million, which are competitive grants in the area of travel, tourism, and outdoors recreation. And then lastly, there's also $1 million in statewide planning, research, and networks grants, including funding for state planning efforts, and of particular interest to you, grants to build communities of practice to technical assistance to support EDA's work. Finally, I will say that EDA is also focusing on coal communities and our coal community commitment, which is allocating $300 million to ensure the support for these communities as they recover from the pandemic. More importantly, as they create new jobs and opportunities, including the creation or expansion of new industry sector, new industries overall. Each of these programs will benefit tribal and Indigenous communities, and we are committed to distributing this critical assistance in a very equitable manner. In fact, equity is our first investment priority. I also want to note that our traditional economic development programs can also be substantial assistance to you. From planning to infrastructure, we can help in every step along the way. I encourage you to visit eda.gov or to reach out to our regional contacts for more information. Next, I'd like to note EDA recently updated its regulation to make our grants more accessible to Indigenous community. Not only was this an exciting change, but it was a very needed change. The new rule, which was published on September 24th in the Federal Register, extends EDA's tribal eligibility to include for-profit entities that are wholly owned by and established for the benefit of a tribe. This action follows a government-to-government consultation in April between EDA and tribal leaders and their representatives who were broadly supportive of the eligibility expansion. Through this rule change, EDA hopes to increase the number of tribal applications for the further benefit of those communities. Later in the program, you will hear more about this rule change from our EDA Chief Counsel, Jeff Roberson, who will present on the rule change. Of course, we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have following the presentation. But before I close, I want to again thank RICO and the Native American Finance Officers Association for their participation. Now, I am also thrilled to introduce to you EDA's first ever Tribal Engagement Coordinator, Carol Lee Wenderoth. Carol Lee joined EDA in September, and in her role as Tribal Engagement Coordinator, Carol Lee is responsible for fostering tribal knowledge of EDA programs and advancing stakeholder engagement. Carol Lee is a member of the Confederate Salish and Setonai tribes in Western Montana. Forgive me for the pronunciation, I tried my best, but with great honor, I am excited to have Carol Lee as part of our team. She also began her service at the Minority Business Development Agency as an expert consultant to the Office of Native American Business Development and served as an advisor to the agency on tribal affairs. Prior to her federal service, Carol Lee was a tribal land department head for the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes, responsible for the land use management of 1.3 million acres making up the Flathead Indian Reservation. Carol Lee holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Montana State University. I want to thank you again, and I want to not only express my sincere and very authentic invitation to continue to work with us. As it was said before, these are historic times, and one that we will not only hopefully look back with great pride of what we did together, but most importantly, being able to dream bigger, dream boldly, to make sure that our communities are served. So with that, I want to pass it on to Carol Lee, and thank you again for this moment in allowing me to speak to you today.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm thrilled to join EDA as a Tribal Engagement Coordinator. I look forward to working with all of you in supporting and advancing EDA's work throughout Indigenous communities. As said before, this is a great opportunity and it's a great time to join EDA. And I look forward to the opportunity to work with you all. And please reach out to me with any sort of questions or comments that you have. I look forward to joining the team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol Lee, and thank you, Rico, and thank you, Assistant Secretary Castillo. I am going to turn it over to our Chief Counsel, Jeff Roberson, who's going to talk us through our eligibility rule change.
Hey, everyone. It's nice to join you today. As Secretary Castillo already mentioned, in April, we did a tribal consultation to discuss a potential rule change to expand the eligibility for tribes to include for-profit entities in certain circumstances. And the results of that consultation were really promising and a lot of positive feedback. I'll talk about the questions that came up in just a minute, but ultimately because of that feedback and the positive impact that we thought that we were expecting to come from this, in that a lot of current tribal activity by the governments of the tribe are actually done through some of these for-profit organizations. We thought this rule would open up an opportunity to get more EDA funds into tribal lands in a responsible manner. So with that, on September 21st, we made the rule final. And what the rule does, as has been mentioned, is it expands eligibility under our Indian tribe definition to include for-profit entities that are wholly owned by and operated exclusively for the benefit of tribes. Those two limitations are important. We're not just opening up to any for-profit. It has to be something that is tribally owned. and also for the benefit of the tribe. And the way we're going to check those two things, and this was a frequent discussion in the consultation process, so we made a special note to address it in the rule, but also in our practices, is we're going to look at the articles of incorporation. We're going to look at their bylaws. We're going to look at their ownership structures to verify that those things are actually the case before we determine that they're actually eligible for EDA grants. And that's a process we actually do already for nonprofits to make sure that they're similarly situated. So we have a lot of practice with that sort of analysis. It's new to us in the for-profit realm, and we're going to keep our eyes open to make sure this rule is working as intended. We'll be ready and willing and able to make any changes if it's having negative consequences in a way that was not predicted. Our hope, though, is that it's going to be a big boon for the tribal communities in terms of getting more access to EDA grant money and having more money flow into those communities in a responsible manner. And I guess the other thing that I would mention, the other set of questions that were prominently discussed in the consultations actually ended up becoming moot because of the Supreme Court. There was a lot of questions about how this would affect Alaska Native corporations, and that ended up becoming mooted out by a Supreme Court case that was decided recently, the House opinion, and it basically said that Native corporations are eligible as Indian tribes for federal government programs. So our rule doesn't technically affect them because the Supreme Court answered the question for us. So this rule has nothing to do with Alaska Native corporations. And so with all of that, I think you'll find that hopefully this rule is opening up more funds. Now, we obviously have an Indigenous communities NOFO that's exclusively for Indigenous communities and nonprofits that support them in Pacific Islanders. And that NOFO is obviously available to you, but I wanted you to make clear that this rule change immediately affects that NOFO. It also, which is a notice of funding opportunity, that's the way that we announce the grants are available. It's also immediately effective in all our other NOFOs. So our normal core funding, the other 5 American Rescue Act NOFOs, which Indian tribes are eligible for under all of those programs. It's not just the Indigenous communities NOFO, it is every EDA program this rule change immediately affects. So if this is something of interest to you, it's something that can be explored under any of our notices of funding opportunity. And with that, I'll stick around to answer questions later on in the session in case there are any more, and I've been answering some of them in the text as well, but I'll turn it back over to Mara.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And yes, we will be answering specific questions in the second half of the webinar. But for now, I want to turn it over to our Deputy Assistant Secretary, Dennis Alvord, who will be speaking to the parameters of our Indigenous Communities Challenge. If we can move to the next slide. Great, thank you so much. Dennis, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Mara, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I'm really excited to share with you some information about EDA's first ever funding notice of opportunity that's dedicated exclusively to Indigenous communities. Let's go ahead to the first slide. As Assistant Secretary Castillo mentioned, EDA has received a nearly unprecedented supplemental appropriation under the American Rescue Plan. And that supplemental appropriation is specifically targeted to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus pandemic and the economic impacts that resulted from the pandemic. The programming is purposefully targeted at accelerating economic recovery from the pandemic and building more resilient economies that our grantee recipients will be able to bounce back more quickly from future economic shocks. Go to the next slide. So, as Alejandra mentioned, we actually have 6 distinct notices of funding opportunity under our American Rescue Plan funding. I won't belabor that here, but what we wanted to point out is that each of those funding streams was specifically designed to kind of target a particular economic development need, be it jobs for today, building communities, sustainable communities for the future, and really innovating and trying to build the next generation economies in regions for the future as well. And our Indigenous communities NOFO is meant to meet one of those needs, but as Alejandra said, would certainly encourage you all to consider whether or not any of our other notices of funding opportunity might also be able to meet the particular needs of your community. We can go to the next slide. Great. So as I mentioned, for the first time ever, EDA has a dedicated notice of funding opportunity for $100 million for Indigenous communities. This is really in recognition that our Indigenous communities and Native communities were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, both from a health and economic perspective. And therefore, we've made this funding available exclusively to those entities. The eligible entities include Indian tribes or consortiums of tribes, and to be state-recognized tribes, unrecognized tribes, nonprofits or for-profits that do not fall within the definition of Indian tribe are not eligible for the funding, however. Public, private, nonprofit organizations and associations that serve Native Hawaiians, Native Pacific Islanders, and others would be eligible under this funding opportunity. But you certainly may, as I said before, avail yourself of the opportunity to apply for funding under any of the other EDA American Rescue Plan NOFOs. We can go to the next slide. So as Jeff mentioned, we have had a very recent rule change, and we have modified the definition of Indian tribe to broaden eligibility. This slide is meant to capture overall eligibility by defining that term, which includes the governing body of an Indian tribe, a nonprofit Indian corporation, an Indian authority, any other nonprofit tribal organization or entity, provided that the organization is wholly owned and established for the benefit of the tribe, as well as nonprofit corporations that are wholly owned and established for the benefit of the tribe. Go to the next slide. So what do the timelines look like? Under this particular notice of funding opportunity, we are accepting rolling applications and awards. So we're targeting July. Well, we've initiated this NOFO in July of 2021. We're targeting getting applications in as quickly as possible because we are under a congressionally mandated deadline to obligate all of the funds by September 30 of 2022. So there's no hard cutoffs or hard deadlines on this, but I would encourage interested entities to submit their applications as early as possible. It's a rolling competitive process. So the sooner that you get into the queue, the sooner that you can be considered. And as we do have to have all the funds obligated by September of 2022, at a certain point, we will have exhausted all of the available funding that we have under this NOFO. However, once the award is made in September of 2022, entities will have until May of 2027 to fully put that funding to use. So the period of performance for the award can run for 5 years after the date of obligation. So plenty of time to implement a wide variety of different types of economic development projects. Next slide. So what are some of those projects? Well, we have received this funding under EDA's Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. That is one of EDA's most flexible programs. It allows us to, in a wide range of different types of activities. Those include everything from planning and technical to workforce development and support for entrepreneurship. Also includes the ability for us to capitalize locally administered revolving loan funds that can help to fill, critically important access to capital gaps, to provide both working capital for businesses or to support new startups and entrepreneurs. And finally, the ability for us to fund brick and mortar construction, various different types of infrastructure and public works projects. We encourage applications that are based on long-term sustainable development outcomes. We take a regional focus to economic development and want to make sure that those strategies are going to foster economic growth and resilience in their regions. And of course, any project that supports economic recovery from the pandemic is going to be eligible. We can go to the next one, thanks. So there are a few differences, though, specifically for the Indigenous communities NOFO from our traditional economic adjustment assistance program. We've made a wider range of projects eligible. We're really looking to fund foundational economic infrastructure. Those would include things that like vocational or higher educational facilities or community health facilities that are maybe enabling blocks to allow other types of economic growth and development to occur. So while these types of projects may not traditionally be eligible under our EAA NOFO, we have made them eligible under this NOFO in recognition of some of the specific needs. Important note, projects that directly support casinos or request to replace lost revenue, be it government revenues, et cetera, are not eligible under this NOFO. All of the awards will be made at a 100% grant rate. So there's no particular matching requirement for this funding. And applicants are not required to demonstrate a committed beneficiary or provide a signed ED 900B form in order to be competitive for this funding. So we've tried to reduce some of the additional administrative burdens as well. We will be reimbursing certain pre-award project costs. Again, this is something that typically you may not see as part of EDA's regular programming, but in recognition of the particular needs that have resulted from the pandemic, we wanted to provide as flexible an approach as possible. So this might include reimbursement for things like preliminary engineering reports or environmental and historic preservation required compliance costs. So we're trying to do everything that we can to enable really impactful economic development projects to move through that pipeline as quickly as they can. Next slide. So this is the last slide. We do have a regional structure at EDA, and really would encourage you all to work through that structure. Really the starting point, though, to learn more about the Indigenous communities NOFO is to explore the NOFO itself, which can actually be found in a number of different places. You can go directly to our website at eda.gov/funding-opportunities. There's another web page that has a rich amount of information on all of our American Rescue Plan notices of funding opportunity. That's eda.gov/ARPA. And from that, you can click on any of the different programs and then drill down from there into additional resources, including fact sheets, FAQs, links to the NOFOs, et cetera. You can also access the NOFOs directly through grants.gov, although I see from a chat that's happened during this webinar that there may currently be an outage of that NOFO on grants.gov.
No, we fixed it.
Oh, and we've already fixed it. Great. So we've got that back up and running, so you should be able to access it from there. And then, so the next step would really be to explore alignment with your local economic development district or other economic development planning partners and stakeholders within the region. There's a great resource for that on our website. It's eda.gov/resources/directory. One of the things that we do look for is that all of the economic development projects that we are funding are aligned with the regional economic development strategies for their regions. There are, sometimes exceptions to that where we can accept not just an EDA created CEDS document or comprehensive economic development strategy, but an equivalent CEDS from another federal organization or other economic development planning documents. And then any questions that you have, a great resource is through our American Rescue Plan Indigenous Communities program. If you email us at indigenous@eda.gov, we'll try to get you timely responses back. Each of our regional offices supports a network of state-based economic development representatives. Again, if you visit our website, you can find contacts that are located within either our regional office or many times in one of your states. And I think that's our last slide. I will go back over to Mara, and I think we're going to move into a question and answer session. Mara?
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. Just for some housekeeping notes, I wanted to mention that in addition to the email box that Dennis just mentioned on that eda.gov/ARPA website, we also have detailed questions and answer document that we've created to accompany our Indigenous communities notice of funding opportunity. So if your question is not answered here today, I would definitely recommend that you check that out. I noticed a few of the questions that have come in are answered in that document as well. So I would point you guys over there as well. I think it's a great resource. Dennis, one question for you as we transition to this Q&A portion. So can you speak a little bit to the matching rate that this NOFO, that this Notice of Funding Opportunity provides Indigenous communities?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that, generally speaking, tribal organizations are treated a little bit differently than other eligible entities across all of EDA's programming, whereas they are the only entity that is called out in our authorizing statute that is eligible automatically for a 100% grant rate. And we've carried that forward specifically to our Indigenous communities NOFO. So we're contemplating funding the projects under this NOFO at a 100% grant rate.
And Dennis, can you give us a sense of the size of those awards?
Yeah, there's really a great deal of flexibility. There's no top or bottom for the size of the awards, and we do contemplate being able to fund a wide variety of different types of awards. It could be something as small as a $25,000 or $50,000 technical assistance grant that could help a community to overcome a particular economic development challenge, maybe through a market feasibility study or a planning study of some kind, or take advantage of a newly emerging economic development opportunity, all the way up to a larger, public works project of some type that might bring various types of infrastructure that would enable economic development, like a water or sewer line or broadband infrastructure, or a facility of some kind. Those projects could easily run into the range of $2 or $3 million or sometimes more. I will say that, given that we have $100 million for this program and it's going across the entire project, I do expect many of our projects will kind of fall within that range from, as small as a few $1,000s, maybe up to $2 to $3 million, but we can certainly consider projects of all different sizes.
And Dennis, I know that some of our Indigenous community partners received funding under the CARES Act. Are they eligible for this new ARPA funding?
They absolutely are. And we would certainly encourage those organizations to come forward. I mean, we were quite intentional in our funding under the CARES Act in providing assistance to many of tribal community partners so that they could engage in economic development recovery planning. We're really hoping that funding will result in some really creative and innovative strategies that can help jumpstart the economies that are working so hard to emerge out of the economic impacts of the pandemic. So we'd certainly encourage folks to come back to us if they have implementation projects that have come out of their strategies that they are now ready to move forward with funding on, or if they need more assistance to keep working on those strategies or to keep working on coordination to grow and help their economies recover, we could certainly support follow-on funding through this Indigenous Communities Challenge as well.
Great, thank you so much, Dennis. Jeff, I am going to turn it over to you for a couple of questions. There's some questions in the chat. Can you just sort of clearly describe, are Alaska Native corporations eligible for EDA funding, and sort of spelling out their eligibility with regard to just a normal category, or whether or not it has to do with this rule that we've put in place currently? Sure.
Yeah, they're eligible as an Indian tribe based on the new Supreme Court case. So just definitionally, they're eligible. It has nothing to do with the new rule.
Got it. Thank you. Jeff, a question that has come in the chat is, are there any ineligible projects that we would not fund under this Indigenous Communities NOFO?
Yeah, it's hard to conceptualize necessarily off the top of my head what those might be, but they would be things that are owned or operated by a for-profit that's not wholly owned or are operated for the benefit of a tribe. So we wouldn't be enhancing those or anything like that. It would be things like housing, just straight up housing we wouldn't do. We're doing a little bit more sort of community development type work than we would normally do under this one. Just because these communities need it. Those are the two that come to the top of my head.
What about casinos or that kind of activity?
Oh, yeah, that's a good call. No, we don't fund casino. We don't give grants to casinos either. It's a longstanding government policy to not do that. But there are sort of nonprofit, or they might have a nonprofit arm, or like a civil service arm that might be eligible, but in general, no.
Great. Another question that I've seen emerge here is, sort of how quickly can our stakeholders and our partners expect to hear back if they submit an application, like now?
It's a good question. I think we are trying to get back as soon as possible. But we do have rolling competitions, so it takes a certain amount of time for some of those projects to build up and to be reviewed. But for a construction project, 6 months-ish. I saw, Dennis, you got off mute.
Yeah, I think I was going to go in the same direction that you were just about to go, and Jeff, and that is, it may vary a little bit based on the project type. So a planning or technical assistance grant, those tend to move through the process a little more quickly. They're a little more straightforward for us to process. Those tend to be maybe in the ballpark of three to 4 months. Whereas a construction project, because they have to go through various levels of environmental review, architecture and engineering analysis, et cetera, those are going to take a little bit longer. So those might be more like six or more months.
And that gets us to another set of questions, which is, can folks apply for multiple projects? Can folks apply under multiple notices of funding opportunity? And can a particular tribe that might have different entities underneath it, a for-profit entity, a nonprofit entity, apply separately under those notices? Sorry, lots of questions there.
No, but that's a good way to combine them all, because the answer is basically yes. Just don't submit the same project more than once. So if it's literally the same building, don't put it under more than one NOFO. Don't have more than one person send it in. Just send each project in once. But each entity, they can, submit multiple projects. They can submit multiple entities within an organization can submit things. They just have to be separate ideas, essentially.
Great. And one other question that I saw emerge was, how does this rule change impact nonprofit tribal entities. Are they
Doesn't
still
change.
eligible?
It does, yes, they're still eligible. It doesn't change a thing for them.
Great. I also saw a question come in about multiple regions. So there may be tribes that span multiple EDA regions. Where should they submit their application?
So a couple of some of those tribes that span have traditional relationships with one of our regions, so they should, continue to have that. If you're new or you don't have a traditional relationship and you're not sure, normally we would suggest that you contact the region that you're predominantly located in. And if need be, those two regions will talk to each other and figure out if there's some reason why there's a better reason for you to be in one of those two regions. But where you're predominantly located is most likely the best answer.
And that's actually a good reminder that, let's say we have Indigenous community that submits an application under our travel and tourism notice of funding opportunity, but perhaps the project type might be better suited under another notice. How will EDA deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one thing that EDAs will do is we'll work with you to help you find the right NOFO. And if you apply to the wrong one, from our perspective, it's probably, there's some of them overlap, so it's easy to do this. We'll work with you to move to the right one, or the best one, or the one where you have the best competitive chance, because remember, all of these are competitive. And in some cases that might require a little bit more information from you, but we'll work with you to do that. The objective here is to have the highest number of competitive projects we can under every one of our NOFOs. So we'll move people around to as necessary to fill out those NOFOs.
And I think, another question that comes to mind from that is, given that this is a new eligibility type that we're expanding just, over the last month, folks are curious, are they eligible? They want to make sure that they know that before they submit a full application. How will EDA work with these entities, these newer entities, to make sure that they either are eligible on the front end or they're not eligible? Will we work with them before they submit the full application, and how should they go about getting in that queue?
Yeah, it's a good question. This has come up with some nonprofits as well, because they might be organized in sort of an odd way, or it's not really clear because their ownership structure is a little bit odd, or are they operating for the benefit? It's sort of an interesting question. So they'll ask us, do we qualify? So what we've been doing is on a case-by-case basis. If you submit it to your local economic development representative, they'll probably work with my legal staff to help you make a call on whether or not you're eligible or not, because we don't want you to waste your time applying and we're just gonna be like, sorry, you never had a chance. That's not fair.
A question that kind of follows up from that is our SEDS requirement. What are some of the other types of documents or planning documents that we would accept that are not our formal SEDS?
Yeah, there's a lot of plans out there that do this. There's a lot of locally developed economic development plan. We're looking for sort of the comprehensive look at your assets and liabilities, and if you have a coherent thought process for where you want to go. And there's a lot of documents to do that. There's sometimes some HUD plans do that. There are statewide plans that do it. Sometimes some of the tribes have developed their own plans that are not necessarily our SEDS, but they are an economic development roadmap. And so there's a lot of things out there that'll serve this purpose. And that's something else that we can work with you. We can actually look at those and help you figure out if they work. And sometimes we even have suggestions. We might know a plan that exists in your area that has been used before or that we think is a good model. Yeah, and your local economic development representative is the person who will be able to help with that.
Great. Some questions about state recognized Indian tribes. Are they eligible under this funding opportunity?
Unfortunately, no.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff. I wanted to see if there was any folks from our other panelists, perhaps NAFOA, if you had any questions or any additional thoughts that you wanted to add to the conversation. Otherwise, we will take a couple more questions and then I think we'll be wrapping it up soon. Great. So with this content, we will be sharing these slides on the EDA website. We will also be sharing a copy of this recording so you can listen to it and watch it whenever. And I did want to remind folks that we have lots of resources on the EDA website. There's also an email box that is directly responsive to our Indigenous communities notice of funding opportunity. There we go, thank you. Really just extremely grateful that folks logged in today. This is a very historic opportunity for folks to apply, and we're extremely interested in receiving applications. You can apply now. There's a number of resources here, and really just thank you very much for participating. Thank you to NAFOA for helping us co-host this webinar. Thank you to Deputy Assistant Secretary Alvord and Chief Counsel Roberson, as well, of course, as Assistant Secretary Castillo for joining us at the onset. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your participation today.
Thanks.
Thank you. We will end that webinar now. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.